Hey, let's get started with our next session in the spirit of rhythmic thinking, performance, performing rhythm, thought. It's my pleasure to welcome Michael Gallope. That's our third Michael in the sequence. So mentally, I've been saying, okay, Michael G. I don't know if that's, I don't know. Michael is Associate Professor of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Minnesota. He's author of Deep Refrains, Music Philosophy, and the Ineffable, published in 2017 with University of Chicago Press, and The Music as Philosopher, New York's Vernacular Avant-Garde, 1958 to 1978, published this year at University of Chicago Press as well. As a musician, Michael has worked in a variety of genres that span a range of experimental music, rock, and electronic dance music. In Minneapolis, he performs with the minimal-ambient band IE. Please join me in welcoming Michael.
Thanks so much, Edwin, and thanks, Aaron, for arranging this incredible event. It's really great to be here. I wasn't going to say anything before I played. I've never played music in an academic setting in my life. And so this is a new thing for me. And Michael and Maya and I were just talking about how interesting it is to try to sort of connect the dots in an unfamiliar setting. So I just thought I would say something brief. And also, so much has already happened that I feel like the weight of it is now bearing down upon everything. So I'm trying to figure out how to talk about this in the context of everything we've already said and done. I'll say more about it after I play, but when I moved to Minnesota, I didn't know any musicians there, so I was playing a lot of music, and I got a tenure track job at the University of Minnesota, so my mom was like, you need to focus on getting tenure and stop, going on tour. So I didn't play very much, and then I started to meet musicians in Minneapolis, and there's a kind of experimental music that was fascinating to me that people do in the Twin Cities, which is drone music. They have this 28-hour drone music festival called Drone Not Drones, it's a fundraiser for Doctors Without Borders, and it's a 28-hour continuous drone where you play. It's like you play for 20 minutes, and then you pass off the drone to another group, and then they pass it back, and you kind of it's like a quilt of different musicians playing a single drone over the course of 28 hours. And so there's a whole experimental music scene just around these really long forms where not much is happening. And so I got really excited about this, and I started collaborating with a group of people. And then just a few years ago, around COVID, I started really trying to do a solo project. So this is what you're going to hear is a kind of product of the thinking in that, and it's called Region. That's what I'm just calling it here, and it's really about spatiality and emptiness and arrivals of things. So I don't want to say too much more about it, but I'm happy to play, and thank you for having me, Aaron.
more round of applause for Michael. Thank you. That was a beautiful, powerful. I'm not sure if beautiful is too almost like too simple of a word, unless we think about also the kind of expansiveness of beauty that Maya brought up, with respect to avant-garde and experimental music practice, which is definitely something you're engaged in. I have a couple of questions I wanted to start with and then open it up for, discussion. And the questions are really built from the discussion that we've already been having, really all semester as we engage with all of your work, but also today, different topics that have come up. So, and a lot of this, I'm borrowing the language that, kind of like the words that have been coming up. But I wanted to start by asking you, to talk more about what it means to perform in an academic space, which, on one level is a surface question. Why is it meaningful to you? What sorts of things does it allow for? And why do you think it's typically so difficult to do? But beyond the surface level, of course, and as we got a chance to think about reading your work and the work of others, it relates to a deep refrain, right? And your thought that has to do with an interrogation of the paradoxes or impasses or seeming irreconcilable relations between musical praxis, the limits of language, ineffability, and the production of knowledge. And, that's what we've been talking about a lot. As Erin was summarizing our discussions from this morning, she talked about the question of what's legible or audible, or what is otherwise able to be registered. Maybe not always in expressible, satisfying ways, but what do we do with the break between what's registered in hearing and playing and what's registered in discourse? I see this performance as engaging with this, so I want to note also for all of you that at one point, Michael had said, I don't want to talk, So, I was like, oh my gosh, he's really struggling with this thing right now, you know what I mean? Like, so perhaps, at one point you wanted to make it a point to not speak, as kind of maybe a continuation of this interrogation that you're doing in your written work through a kind of performance strategy. With what you shared and how we experienced. So, so what does it mean to perform in academic space, and what can you say about it?
Thanks so much, Edwin. It's a really tricky question. From the most sociological level is that music departments are not places where there's a lot of creative work, right? It's mostly a kind of culture industry for music education and classical music sort of, training musicians in a professional context. There's, some institutions that you do jazz extremely well, in different kinds of ways. And it's interesting, why that's the case. Why, could you get an MFA in poetry and do avant-garde poetry in an academic context in the 60s and 70s, but in music, it was a kind of academic style composition, and this was racialized in a very particular way, obviously, in the United States, to exclude figures like Ornette Coleman, who probably could have worked as professors, or Alice Coltrane, but would not have been hired. And so I think there's a way in which when we think about music and the production of knowledge, there are very specific historical questions about the way these institutions have been built that have made certain kinds of legitimacy, and again, in a way that's deeply racialized, made that complicated and difficult and unequal. And it's an ideological question. So that's in a kind of broad institutional sense. And then me being the dialectician I am, I think, okay, so what about me personally? How do I feel about that? And I think that, we were just, Michael and Maya and I were talking about it outside, actually. I have become very used to doing my music in another context and doing my creative work in another context at Zebulon over here, or, at culture institutions maybe, or clubs or whatever, in places where, all the kind of the whole semiosis of the scene and the situation makes sense. And it's not going to support like the kind of music I play is not going to support me. So I never looked at it as something that I could commit myself to, but it always existed in a separate space for me, in a separate social space for me. And I think one of the things I couldn't help reflect on seeing the incredibly powerful performances, I mean, first of all the work that and the kind of artistry that Maya and Michael did to synthesize that and that duet and to have their work speak to each other. But just the techne and the existential intensity of presenting work in a context where, I mean, maybe this is just me being, the grizzled academic that I've become, but it's like very easy to sit here and like give a paper or talk about ideas. And it's very challenging to sort of present work in a context that, doesn't historically seem to square with what that object is. And I think that's been an instructive lesson for me in terms of just thinking about music, because the fear and anxiety and intensity of just doing it, that is to me the ontology of the medium. Like if you take that out, if you take the risk that one puts in, the risk of humiliation, the sense that you're going to totally fuck your life up by committing to music, right? If you're going to go down that road, you're being honest with what music is, which is this thing that reveals being, right? It reveals like the deepest pain, and it's trauma, and it's inequity, and it's utopia, and it's ecstasy, and it's these things layered together and in all kinds of uncomfortable ways that we're not very good at even interpreting it most of the time. And I think, maybe there's something about, the way academic spaces have been set up that are just, it's easier to domesticate the art form than it is to sort of, live with some of the political, social, erotic, so like the kind of intensity of it that is just part of the production of the art. And so I think it's a thing where it's like in all of my work, I'm trying to recall that. And in this most recent book, I'm trying to think, like when I go through the archive, like try to listen for those traces of people feeling like their life is at stake in order to sort of get their thing out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really powerful. Sometimes I wonder if, on the one hand, we're thinking about, bringing the academic and this other space together. And then sometimes there's a part of me that's thinking like, but maybe it's nice if they're not. Maybe this other place is this like safer place, or allows me room to do things I couldn't do. And I kind of like that. Maybe I don't want to introduce myself as a professor, because that will mess the vibe up even, you know what I mean? And I don't want people to, think I know things, for example. Do you struggle or think about that aspect also? Like what that's part of the risk of bringing these together is that, maybe that other world, is now a here world, you know what I mean? And therefore doesn't serve as the refuge in the same way maybe as before.
Yeah, this has changed for me over the last 10 years. So when I first started, I mentioned my mom was telling me not to play so much music. So I had this very paranoid, like, okay, I'm not going to tell anybody if I go on tour or do something. And at the time, I was playing with this Sierra Leonean musician, Janka Nabe, and I was managing it. It was like an intense kind of West African Afrobeat style electronic dance music band. I was playing keyboards in it, and it was just as far away from the academic world as you can imagine in terms of the situations that we were in. And so I had become very used to separating them. And then, maybe it's something of being a state university like the University of Minnesota, but and also being in a very wacky department, cultural studies and comparative literature, which has, it's a bunch of lefties who we all have different perspectives on what it means to be a lefty, right? And there's a lot of students that actually don't see a distinction. They do creative work, they live praxis in all these different ways. And so when they meet you and they're in a teaching space and then they see you at a show, they're like, this is great, you know? So part of it was the community, I think, wore down some of those boundaries for me in Minneapolis, where there was, you know, the public institution, my attitude became, it's like, oh, it's less this distinctive realm, but it's more like, this is a public good. And in order for it to remain a public good, like, it should be available in as many ways as possible. And I don't want to draw boundaries around it. But it took me a while to come to that.
I want to have a few other questions, but I'm just going to ask one and then open it up. And then if there are no questions, I can hog the microphone even longer. I'm so glad you were talking about your other musical experiences too. And just like the programming this event has been kind of interesting, the musical playlist that's gotten sort of put together. And I feel like there is a logic or coherence that maybe is coming, you know, after the fact. But I wanted to talk about groove. Can we talk about groove? And grooves. And I was thinking about the talks this morning about fragments and shattered pieces. And I started wondering about grooves as sites of a kind of cut, but that are also where and how things might fit together. You know, Maya was talking a little bit about groove also in that presentation. We can think, of course, along with Alex Wahilie here and think about the imbrication of rhythm and the grooves of history and sound technologies. And we can ask how rhythmic feeling good can serve in the suturing of historic trauma, the suturing of the body, as was mentioned this morning in some of the comments, or of an aesthetic, but also maybe suturing the human and the machine. So that's kind of the general question I wanted to ask, since we've been discussing repair. How do grooves do reparative work? How do they afford possibilities of reconciliation, or perhaps open up possibilities for reincarnation after death? And more specifically, I would love to hear you talk about how groove, you know, rhythmic feeling a certain kind of way, how grooves manifest and work within the aesthetic and temporal and spatial context of drone music, experiencing and performing. You know, I'm also curious about like the performance, you know, of the music, you know, and how does your music put you in a groove of being, a groove of feeling, and also of speculation. But take it wherever you want.
So what I played today didn't have much groove. Obviously, it's sort of anti-groove, or it's like it's about there's a lot of emptiness, and something happens, and you don't really know what it is, and there's language-like stuff, maybe like. I don't know if it's a conversation. I want to create something that I don't understand. So that's what I'm searching for, and it's very much about reincarnation. I'm searching to kind of, I'm searching for, Michael and I were talking about creating metaphysics, you know, which is, sometimes it's not going to happen, you know? Otherwise it wouldn't, that's what music is. It's like trying to find that. And I think, so, but there's a parallel to groove. It's like, I find groove very hard. I mean, I played a lot of dance music, and I'm the kind of person, after I've recorded, I'm like, you know, doing little edits and like pushing stuff behind the beat to like make it, just because I can't, I want it to be, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I wish I could do that live, right? Just like have that kind of like, whatever it is, like maybe if I, you know, had like a bigger body and I had like more relaxation or something, I could like find that side of the groove where it was like a little bit behind the beat, and I just can't do it. But when it works, it's like the unconscious is open or something. You know, it's like there is this disclosure when it's happening and when it's dancing. And I was feeling that a lot, you know, during various moments like of this collaboration, and it's about volume and there's a fragility to it. And then when it's locked in, it's like the, you know, I don't know, there's just like, the historicity of, I mean, in terms of forms, in terms of the break, in terms of blackness, and like the way we were talking about, you know, Michael Sawyer's talk earlier with respect to Moten, and all of these metaphors of formal displacement and thinking. When that groove is truly alive, that thinking is like, it's like suddenly three-dimensional for me, and it's like, and there's a whole lot happening, but it's very tricky to put it into shape. And I'm like, I guess I'm very respectful of people that specialize in it, because it's an incredible thing, to find that attunement and to be able to be with it. And there's a certain almost passivity to it, like letting it happen.
Yeah, after you performed, I almost wanted to say that it was glorious, but then I was remembering that and I definitely, Alice Coltrane, Ornette Coleman, like it could make you hear a musical history, when you listen to electronic music and its experimental dimensions, and then you think about the play of tone that's happening with artists that you're citing. It's really interesting to think about these kind of genealogies, but I also know that you are kind of pushed back against a utopian kind of notion of music, or kind of like an essentializing of music that maybe, in one way I read your work, is like it's kind of a critique of the audiovisual litany, that Jonathan Stern talks about, and the way that music is kind of figured in a certain way with respect to, Judeo-Christian sort of like philosophies and histories. So before we turn it over, I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the notion of paradox within this. And yeah.
I've been accused of being a sonic or a musical exceptionalist, which is, maybe I am sort of, and I don't even know what that means. I mean, I think in my work, I am trying to, going to school and learning about semiotics and being a part of this. We talked about the linguistic turn, like everything being a kind of using language and metaphor as a model for everything. I think part of me was like trying to push against that and like understand what the specificity of sound and its inconsistency, how it operates, because it's obviously filled with all kinds of language-like things, but there's also there's a difficulty that one has in, it's sort of, I always say it's like an embarrassment. Like, okay, you could talk about music for a while, and then when you press play, or when like Maya goes and sits at the piano, or Michael turns on it's like there's just this surplus that's impossible to remember. It's just like, oh, I forgot how complicated that groove is when we were breaking down. I mean, and just like looping a single thing and finding the multidimensionality in it. I think in my work, I am trying to sustain attention, not like I'm some sort of theologian for music that believes it exists in some totally separate space, but just trying to call attention to the character of like, it's the depth of it and the oddity of it and the sort of multidimensional inexhaustibility of it. You sit down and you find that magnetic groove or a loop of something, and it's like you could sit there and listen to it for, Alex was talking about 16 hours, like wait until 5 a.m. or something like that. How does that happen, right? It's a kind of fascination, I guess.
Let's open it up for questions. You just go from left to right.
Thanks so much. That performance for me really expanded a lot of categories, and I wanted to ask you, Michael, what is it like to play music where overtones are, it's not even hard to call it overtones, the primary thing. I mean, I was really struck with the care with which you set up what then became a drone, and there were so many choices you made in the beginning to kind of support what was to come in terms of how you were honing those opening tones, that then became the basis for the more playing. And to me, that's where the groove really resided, is in that whirring. What would be erroneously taken as a single tone, and all the movement and the groove. It just seemed like you had so much patience and really not proceeding to the next phase until you had kind of laid that groundwork. And so I'm just wondering, what is it like to hear and kind of prepare in that way?
That's helpful. I don't think anyone's ever. Yeah, I mean, that is kind of. This keyboard is the drone keyboard, and it's a Casio tone from the 80s. But this is one of the things where like 90% of the sounds I don't like, but there's a few things that are just magic. There's like metaphysics on a couple of these buttons for some reason, and these only cost $100, and they're made like toys, so you could just throw them around; they don't break. But it's an 80s keyboard, and then you put it on top of the Yamaha organ drone. And then suddenly they just see this instability, right? And then you can kind of just take a few variables and play with that. And so I think part of it was there's a lot of drone music that, in the scene in Twin Cities, there's a lot of, you have laptop-based stuff, you have modular synthesis, which is a whole nother can of worms in terms of indeterminacy. You have live performance, you have homemade instruments. And I was interested in the idea of these instruments make a keyboard like an organ will make one sound. And then you can layer drones and do things and people kind of hear your decisions and maybe they're listening with you or you want them to listen with you. And that became an interesting kind of thing for me, is to find a way to sort of move through it and build it and make it, it's kind of, I think of it as a sculpture maybe.
So the Brazilian scholar and musician José Miguel Sinic, in his book Sons and Chambers, Sound and Sense, has this wonderful moment at the beginning where he derives pitch and then harmony from rhythm, right? An oscillation. And this also goes to what Maya was just mentioning in terms of beats. But I also noticed that just before the sort of ending, if we wanted to call it that, when the car alarm took over, your piece entered into what we might call a rhythm section, right? Pitch sort of fell away, and then you're really asking us to focus on that more oscillatory part that's no longer pitched. And so I was wondering, how does, not necessarily just that moment, but how does this allow you to think, and us to think through rhythm, given that that's one of the focuses today, but that this is also very ostensibly a rhythmic music. Right. It isn't, but right.
Yeah, it's
visualizing in a really interesting kind of a way.
At the end, I do the difference tones is what sometimes they're referred to. So on a very low, when you have low frequencies where the frequency is not that fast, when you have two dissonant frequencies, they phase with each other, and then you start hearing this. And you never know how it's going to sound. It's all dependent on the system. If there's subs, it could make the whole four, and also the resonance of the room. So there's a lot of indeterminacy there. But it's a little bit I don't know, in the 80s, those old TVs where you would turn the channel and then it would be static. I'm very into those kinds of things where it's you just turn it and then there's some weird thing on the television, and so there's just. Yeah, there are kind of cuts in a way.
There's shapes, right?
Yeah.
There's a specific shape, there's a contours in the sound.
Yeah. Just to make sure, unless you were confused, I was trying to express something, this makes it clear I wasn't, it's just the TV's off or something.
So, yeah, this was super interesting in terms of how there seems to be a narrative, but without this stable temporal architecture. So, and especially this last part that at least I perceived it as a narrative through some kind of mimicry of, let's say, these, the sound of shotguns or a helicopter or something like that. So how there was a sense of suspense building up. But how that is usually these specific affects of uneasiness and anxiety are usually attached through, let's say, Hollywood representations of, these kinds of tones that follow, let's say, police chasing or something like that, or shotguns. So how that sense of, in a way, that it was. You said empty space, but how much that empty space creates affect and what it does to our bodies. I just felt my hormonal oscillations, right? Kind of attuning to what you were trying to say or express, but also shaped by these other cultural notions that we have attached to these particular notions of suspense or sounds. And what do you think that your music does? For you and for the audience.
It's great. It is kind of a terrifying way to end it. It's like being caught between two big fans or something like that. but what I'm interested in with sequencing, so you use the word narrative, and I think, you know, there's no causality, right? So if we take Aristotle's definition of narrative, that has causality, right? A beginning, a middle, and end. When you change the TV thing, there's no causality. Other than you switching it so it interrupts and there's a cut. But I'm interested in the way it's like that affects your memory of what you heard before. You know, so it's like, oh, what was that? That was like excessive and weird. But then like after this happens, like what was that thing? And then that's where maybe the language-like stuff maybe comes into the fore, because it's like these things are obviously not related to each other, but they're like maybe related to each other, and you don't want to solve that, you know? I don't know.
Yeah, one more question maybe? Sure. So I'll pick that up and take it from a different angle. So one thing that strikes me about what you just did, and also just drawing in various types of ambient music in general, is that it foregrounds temporal variation and makes us sit with maybe that discomfort, right? There's usually a kind of acclimation period, like in the first maybe minute or two, like, are we really doing this? And 2 or 3 minutes after that, you're like, yeah, we are, and you kind of settle into where you're sitting. And I think about something like the temporal dilation that sets up for you in the moment, but also what it does agree with that sexually. And then I think about your other main form of expression, like on the page, right? And the various types of temporal compression and dilation that are required in either narrative or argumentative discourse. Right? On one side, you can have, a story of 100 Years of Solitude compressed into 400 pages, a whole century, or you could have, the Joycean and Ulysses story of a single day sprawling over 900 pages. So I'm just curious to boil down the question for you, given that your musical and aesthetic sensibilities are taking you in this area, do you feel like you write slower? Are your sentences doing different things with time because of the way that you're playing the time?
That's a great question. I don't think so. I think that, and now I'm thinking about Aristotle for some reason, I'm thinking about narrative, but my teaching is really Aristotelian. There's like, it's organized, and my writing, when I write, it's just like, shh, I'm just editing. And the thing, music, I don't know if other musicians feel this way, music writing difference, which is that like, for my writing, I can sit there and keep working on it, and I can trust that it'll always be getting better the more hours I put in on it. I'm like, it's getting better. I'm like finding more things and fixing little sentences. But music, you can go down a hole and make it a lot worse, And all the best music that you write is like the stuff that happens by accident. It's like, oh yeah, that was the throwaway tune, and then we took the beat out, and it was actually great, And a lot of music is like, I kind of choose not to play for a while or not to listen. Like I can't listen to a lot of music, especially in the age of streaming. I actually have listened to less, just because I just can't do it. Like it kind of crowds me out. And so they have two different economies for me in a weird way, but that doesn't mean they don't affect one another. And I don't know how you both, or anyone, but it's like, so they have two different economies, but what they really have affected is like the things I pay attention to as a writer, and it's like, what is that surreal unconscious depth of why someone would, come out to hear music, that the strangeness of that and the metaphysics that people are trying to incarnate. Like if I'm going to write about music, I need to make sure that particularity is alive in some way, or that I'm listening to the archive in a way that's attentive to that. And so it's affected what I pay attention to. So it's like I'm not spending as much time like labeling chords, like a music theorist would, or there's lots of biographies in my book, and there's lots of history and backdrop. But I think when I talk about the object, I'm trying to recover like those decisions in those moments that I feel like my practice is helping me think about.
Let's stop there. One more round of applause.